All right, this is the Something Venture podcast. Welcome back. I am Kent Lindstrom, and I am pleased to have as my guest this time on this, the 50th episode, Jonathan Abrams. Jonathan is one of the great entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. If you don't know who he is, he started social networking. I'll say it, he won't maybe, but I will. He started it stone cold with the social network Friendster, and that spawned a few other social networks, some of which have become fairly ubiquitous. Fairly wide-ranging conversation here, but pretty in the beltway about venture capital and entrepreneurship, and some interesting, although possibly unexpected advice for the young entrepreneur. Anyway, hope you enjoy part 1 of 2. This is Jonathan Abrams, Something Venture podcast. Thanks for listening. All right, welcome. This is the Something Venture podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. My guest today, at long last, Jonathan Abrams. How you doing?
Finally.
I know.
I've been waiting to be invited on your podcast for years.
It's the 50th episode. I want to make sure I was good first, and I'm not sure I'm good yet. But so
I'm the 51st.
You're the
51st person you thought to invite.
It'll be the 50th episode,
right?
And in this podcast, I explore the reality behind the Silicon Valley headlines as I sit down with the people who are shaping the way we view the world online and beyond. And boy, have you shaped the way the world works online. Jonathan founded Netscape. That was pretty cool. Worked at Nortel, worked at Netscape, founded Socializer, founded Hotlinks, is the current founder of 2 active and successful companies, both Nuzzle and the Founders Den. And people might know you best for having, and I'll say it, invented social networking. Having invented Friendster, which was the first social network, which eventually Facebook took and went somewhere else with it. Literally wrote the patent on it, which is literally now owned by Facebook.
True.
Did I miss anything?
Oh, probably a few things.
Yeah. Well, that's 6. That's enough. So I thought we should spend like an hour and 20 minutes talking about what you think about the new Microsoft security patch.
Let's angrily debate that. But first, I'd like to hear a word from your sponsors for around 20 minutes.
Oh yeah, exactly. Oh my God. What is it with Silicon Valley podcasts? Like every conversation I have with people in Silicon Valley, which is why I started this, I have a conversation. It's like something really interesting. It's about some VC who's going to jail for sexual harassment or something. And then it's like Game of Thrones around here. And then I listen to Silicon Valley podcasts, and it's like, I don't know, the X32 patch is stupid, and Apple's great. And, oh my God.
That is true. I'd say your podcast is one of the few that tries to get at some of the cultural issues, or some of the more interesting stuff. A lot of the tech industry podcasts are people sort of debating teeny little issues about Google or Apple or Microsoft, and a lot of the blogs. Not the blogs, the podcasts. When somebody mentions on Twitter, oh, they talked about Nuzzle in this podcast, so I go, okay, I'll go and listen to it, and then it's 20 minutes of their ads for all the sponsors.
Right, for MailChimp.
And then a lot of either, angry debates or generic advice.
Yeah, it's a little bit crazy. I don't know. I think it's something in Silicon Valley where people feel... So in Hollywood, people are very funny, right? Like Patton Oswalt's, a funny guy, and his podcast is funny. And then people on Wall Street don't go and do podcasts. So Silicon Valley is like a weird kind of... There's no whatever, George Soros podcast. And people in Silicon Valley kind of feel the need to do it, but they're not as funny as people in Silicon Valley.
Are there any financial podcasts?
There are, but they're not like in Silicon Valley, I just think people do it to promote themselves and promote their brand. I don't think anybody like on Wall Street, I don't think the guy running like a hedge fund is like, hey, this is my
Well, there's that Mad Money guy on TV.
Oh, Kramer.
Right. But that's not the people running the hedge funds.
Yeah.
Right. And then, the idea that the VCs and CEOs who are actually doing stuff should be wittily commenting on it is not necessarily a valid idea. Maybe other people.
And I guess if you get too famous, and maybe I've done this to myself too, talking about like gay issues in Silicon Valley, black people, transgender. I guess you get to be a big enough CEO and you can't say very much, or you're on Wall Street and you can't say very much.
Well, when Tim Cook was on Colbert, he, had some interesting conversations about that, but he's pretty rare.
Yeah, well, he's really rare. I didn't realize until I did this podcast that there were, until he came out, and he came out in kind of...
Recently.
And in the mellowest way possible, right? He was like, FYI, it's true. Mm-hmm. It's none of your business. But there's that transgender woman who founded United Therapeutics, but there's no openly gay CEO in all of the Fortune 500.
And not many funny ones.
Not many funny ones. And I asked a guest, he's a gay executive, why? Because he's like, look, 10% of them are gay. If you play the stats, probably 50 out of 500. And he's like, it probably has to do with the international thing, meaning there's some countries where if you come out as openly gay, it may be an issue for your employees. So it might not just be that they're being
There's some companies and
uncool.
countries that have crazy laws, and they have employees in other countries. Those countries have crazy laws.
Yeah.
There's complicated issues.
Well, in any case, Silicon Valley is kind of death for good entertainment. Every show that's made about Silicon Valley is not that funny, right?
Or completely unrealistic.
Yeah, but...
Or both. But, you were talking about Wall Street. I mean, the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas, that was a good movie.
Yeah, that was a good movie.
And you and I are really enjoying that new show, Billions.
Billions is fantastic.
But what that show, what's on that show and what the daily life of a person working at a hedge fund, it's probably very, very different.
Yeah.
I mean, the people who really work at hedge funds probably sit in front of a computer screen, not that different than you and I.
Yeah.
But instead of, coding or doing email, they're probably looking at, their Bloomberg terminal or complicated financial charts, and they're working on trading algorithms, and it's probably very, very unglamorous.
Yeah.
It's people sitting in front of a computer, and that would make a horrible TV show.
Yeah, that happened to me early on. I was at a startup, and Poe Bronson, the writer, so he's going to do a TV show. He's like, I'm going to come and observe you guys for a day. And so he came and observed us for a day, and it was just that. It was like a bunch of people tapping away at computers, and in the middle of the day going, hey, you want to go get lunch? And that was it. And then so the next thing we heard, Poe's like, yeah, I think I'm going to set this in a fictional advertising agency in Los Angeles. I was like, oh, well.
Well, Poe actually wrote a book about a startup. It was called The First 20 Million is Always the Hardest, and it was a novel about a startup. And it actually got turned into a movie that was so bad it went, I think, direct to video.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Oddly enough, directed by Harold Ramis, but still really bad. And then Poe, he gave up the Silicon Valley beat, and he started writing about families and people's careers and lives and what they should do with their lives and things a lot more broad in appeal than the Silicon Valley stuff. But, that was, he was writing about opinions and startups back, I guess, in the original dot-com boom. And then it became hot again a few years, in the last few years. And you had is that coming from outside?
Yeah, it's coming from outside.
From Founders Den Construction.
Yeah.
Then we had sort of 10 years after that, there were other people sort of, again, trying to sort of make the Silicon Valley lifestyle sexy.
Yeah.
Which it really isn't, but people are still trying, like that Bravo reality show.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's kind of a strange situation in that you've got sort of these people who aren't, I guess by nature, the coolest people. Like in school, they were off coding. They weren't maybe the football stars and stuff like that. And that's fine. And they go and build these things that change the world. And I think more, maybe to a lot of people's minds, they go and create these vast fortunes. I mean, guys on Wall Street, are ridiculously rich, and they make $20 million a year. Guys like Mark Zuckerberg make $20 million in interest on their, $80 billion every, quarter. And so I think there's a lot of people in the rest of the country that are a little bit perplexed by how that works. They're ambitious, and they kind of come to Silicon Valley and like, how do I make my $1 billion? But my sense is that it's very different from Wall Street, and that at Wall Street you can go and you can kind of manufacture your way to a big job, right? You can go to Harvard, you can network, you can work at Goldman Sachs.
But not everybody gets the job at Goldman Sachs.
No,
remember in the movie The Big Short, two of the guys, remember they're those young guys that are buddies that were in on the idea of actually shorting the subprime mortgages.
Right.
Remember, they were not at one of the fancy banks. Remember, they went to the lobby and they wouldn't even let them in.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
So even in the world of finance,
there
are people who are not fancy enough to get the really good jobs at Goldman Sachs.
Right.
And so if you get into the Goldman Sachs, you're probably guaranteed to make a lot of money.
Yeah, a ton of money. Well, in fact, I was talking to one of my, I don't know why I started doing this. I'm like the worst poster child for, any Silicon Valley diversity or anything like white guy. But I was asking one of my African-American guests, why aren't, he went to a reunion from Stanford, and all his black friends were really doing well, but they were all working at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and places like that. They weren't becoming entrepreneurs. I was like, why not? And he said, well, his thesis is if you grew up somewhat disadvantaged and you get to the point where Goldman Sachs says, hey, do you want $900,000 a year to come work for us? You kind of take that job and you take that path. And his point was people like Mark Zuckerberg are actually more risk-taking because they're actually more secure. Which is, Mark Zuckerberg comes out here and fails. He's not, he's not worrying about feeding a family. He goes back and becomes a doctor, something like that.
Somebody who's not the first person in their family to even go to college is probably more willing to take a risk on some startup, and if it doesn't work, then they're like, oh, then I have to go work at Facebook.
Yeah, right.
But I think it does also sort of get into some of the difference between entrepreneurs and VCs, because a lot of the VC world is really dominated by a lot of Harvard and Stanford business school graduates. Yeah. And if you've taken that career path, you were pretty high achiever to get into such elite universities and very expensive. So either you were, did have a wealthy family, or you, really hustled and be able to somehow pull that off. But it's, the farthest from a risky choice. I mean, getting an MBA from one of the two most prestigious universities in the country is like one of the sort of safest choices you could make in your career. And not, obviously you have to be smart and you have to work hard, and not everybody can get into those universities or succeed there. But if you can do it, that's still sort of a path to like almost guaranteed success. Yeah. Whereas starting your company, you're probably going to fail. And a lot of entrepreneurs are dropouts and immigrants and kind of, weirdos. Right. And whereas, there are definitely some VCs who are former entrepreneurs, but it's probably less than half, and there's so many of them who've gone to these elite business schools. So I think that just is an indication of a different risk profile.
Yeah, it's a really weird dichotomy, because I think if you're a VC, you're kind of invested in like 100 different things or 50 different, 100 different things. Like you might personally have invested in 10 different companies, and then your firm invested in 100 different companies. So if any given company fails or has a tough time and doesn't raise money and, writes that letter, hey, it's not going to work out, it doesn't really affect you. You still make your $800,000 a year, and that's probably not even a high enough number. If you're an entrepreneur, it's the end of a dream, the end of your life. I mean, it's a very dramatic, it's just like an enormous difference between the two roles.
Well, I agree. I mean, we are friends with many VCs. We have lots of VC investors, and I think many of them have a different perspective. They work very hard. It's a very competitive business. They have so many other VCs they're being compared to, and I think many of them think, boy, what I'm doing is super hard. But, from our perspective, Y Combinator recently started talking about this concept of is your startup default dead or default alive?
What the hell does that mean?
To really brutally force people to sort of confront the fact that if your current funding that you already have isn't going to take you to cash flow positive, you're not default alive, you're default dead. Yeah. Now, hopefully, if you continue to do well and hit milestones and the funding environment doesn't go totally bad, like you will be able to raise more money, like many companies do. But it's a way to sort of like brutally confront whether you're sort of out of the existential risk that most startups are in.
Right.
And and if you're not profitable yet, if the funding that you have in the bank will take you to probably the profitability, then you're one of the rare startups that's defaults alive.
Right.
And if I think about sort of an entrepreneurial career versus a VC career, for the average venture-backed entrepreneur, the average venture-backed startup, the likelihood is that company will not succeed.
Right.
If you are a venture investor and you're investing in a portfolio of companies, the likelihood that you will fail as a venture investor, I mean, if you invest in all horrible companies that are all failed, eventually you're not going to have a career in that industry. But
eventually, in this case, is 7 years of huge paychecks or 5 years or some very long time scale compared to other businesses.
Yeah, that is true. I've seen some of the VCs we know who like to joke back and forth on Twitter saying, VCs can get fired too, meaning that the LPs will decline, the opportunity to invest in the next fund if you haven't done well. But the reality is that's not really being fired. That's like a startup failing to raise another round versus being abruptly fired. And and as you said, that still would lead to several years of higher paycheck than most founders
Right.
Are taking in. And the Kauffman Foundation had a report where they talked about the venture industry and returns and compensations, and they pointed out that a lot of times, even before the returns are really known for one fund, oftentimes the second fund is already raised.
Right.
So once you've gotten into the business, which is actually quite hard to get into, it's hard. You have to have pretty specific things to get hired at a big VC firm, and starting your own firm, of course, is
Right.
Tremendously challenging. But if you do get into this somehow, you'd probably go through two funds before you were,
Right.
that was it.
Which is 10 years of getting paid a lot of money.
Probably, yeah. I mean, we saw from the what was that lawsuit, the famous one. She worked at Reddit. Ellen Powell. We saw from the Ellen Powell lawsuit that I think she was getting. It was in the trial. I think she was getting paid $400,000, and she was not a general partner.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, they're probably a general partner to Sand Hill Road firm is probably making at least $1 million a year minimum.
That's just
I mean, that's a lot of money because most founders of venture-backed companies, even if they're the CEO or CTO, are probably paying themselves less than what they would make if they were just working at Google or Facebook.
Right. Yeah, it's such a weird business. I was talking to a VC who was like, "Oh, this is great. You get the job of partner, and if for your whole first year you don't invest in anything, like you pass on everything, like you look like a genius because mathematically 90% of everything fails. So 90% of what you passed on failed. You're like, I was really smart. I passed on that. I passed on that. I passed on that. I can't imagine any other industry where you're like, I didn't do anything for you. And maybe someone in Hollywood passing on scripts for a year or something like that, but
I don't know. Corp dev?
Yeah, I guess corp dev is like that. What is the Silicon Valley thing? I feel like there's something here that you don't get anywhere else where people really need to tell themselves stories about how they got there. I was just thinking we were talking about Mark Zuckerberg, and he's a relatively rich guy and he took a risk and he got lucky, but his kind of backstory is kind of a lot more heroic than that. It feels like VCs do this, like entrepreneurs do this.
Well, there is a lot of revisionist stuff lately for whatever the reason. There's a lot of people these days who claim to have founded companies they really weren't involved in starting.
Right.
Founding means start. The founders are the people who started the company.
Yeah.
It's really not that much more complicated than that. But
Right.
now founders become this thing sort of you can sort of ask for and be given. Just kind of weird. And I don't think that was the case 10 years ago, but that's like a new thing now where a lot of people want sort of the status of the title of founder, and people lie about that. And a lot of the origin myths of companies are not true; they're made up. But I think that's probably true in every industry. I mean, people tell stories and people lie in Hollywood and Wall Street and politics. So I don't think it's unique to Silicon Valley. Maybe the realities of the world just caught up to Silicon Valley. We were sort of toiling in the garage, pretty low profile. When I first moved to Silicon Valley, I had read Jerry Kaplan's book, Startup, and read about these stories about companies like Apple and starting in garages and all that. That was much more low profile back then. The concept of startups and venture capital and entrepreneurs, and now it's almost become fetishized, and it's obviously gone to an extreme now, where there's 3 million accelerators and and reality shows, and and obviously that's the pendulum swings back and forth. But I mean, I think, and there's probably way too many people talking about this kind of stuff. Way too many Medium posts with generic advice, oftentimes from people who still really haven't figured out a lot probably yet, and there's been people who've made fun of those sort of post-mortem failure Medium posts.
Oh, right.
There's posts making fun of the genre of those posts where you somehow, talk about how your company failed, but somehow cast in the light of all this brilliant stuff you did.
Right. You learned a lot. The market wasn't ready for it yet.
All the great things that you somehow did while failing.
Yeah. It's, I love that period of Silicon Valley, the sort of Steve Jobs period. And I was looking back at some of those companies. Those companies too, like Microsoft, when it went public, those were profitable companies. Like those companies raised, like now you raise venture capital. You're like, all right, I'll keep raising the YouTube model, right? I'll keep raising venture capital until somebody big buys me and I get rich. Those companies were like raising a little bit of money, then going out and getting customer. I mean, it's a different type of company than some of these consumer things that are advertising driven. They're going out, they're getting customers, and they were becoming profitable. And they were going public at like Microsoft was like a PE of 8 or something like that. It was just like such a different period. I guess that was before too. We thought that a company could go public and be worth $180 billion.
Well, there are different paths of success, and Microsoft and companies like Microsoft and Intuit, they actually had been around for years and years and years before they raised venture capital. I mean, they didn't go from, idea to series, to seed to post seed to A and, the course of whatever. I mean, they were around for years. It was a different model. And that's okay. I mean, I think you and I noticed that there were some companies in the sort of email service provider space like MailChimp. There were a couple that actually, I think the one was in Australia that actually been around for years and years and years before raising money.
Yeah.
And that's not something from the 80s. I mean, that's a recent example. So there's all different ways to get there, and there is no one fit model that only works. But I mean, I think that people start trying to come up with some sort of magical reproducible formula for startup success, and I don't think that's ever going to work.
Right. Well, and to be fair, when you win at this game, when you're somebody like, I'm just going to use Mark Zuckerberg, you're worth $20 billion. Like, it can't be that easy. It can't be that the game is set up. Now,
well, but the number of people like that are very few.
Right. But the number of people who imagine they're going to be that is not very few. That's part of the trick of Silicon Valley is like, oh, I'm going to get. And it's like, no, you're not.
I don't know why people think that. I mean, if you go into sports or music, the chances that you're going to be Michael Jordan or Prince are pretty low.
I think people are uniquely able to fool themselves in Silicon Valley, though, because they look at Mark Zuckerberg and they kind of go, "Oh, I kind of look like that. I could." Like, I don't think people at a certain age think that there's any chance that they're going to be a basketball player if they're 5.5 feet tall, or are going to be an actor for some.
Well, one weird thing is the people who not only are not just engineers, they're not engineers, but they also haven't worked at Google or Oracle or Microsoft. They haven't even worked in the software industry.
Right.
And then they come up to you or me or any of our friends and say, hey, I have an idea for a website, or I have an idea for an app.
Yeah.
Somebody who spent their whole career not even, in that industry. And it's just such a weird thing because, I wounn't say, hey, Kent, I wear clothes every day, and I have the idea for, some different kind of shirts.
Right.
I don't actually know how to sew. I don't have any connections in the fashion industry, or I have an idea for a restaurant. I don't know how to cook.
Right.
It is kind of weird that people somehow have this silly idea that creating a website or an app is easy, because of course it is not.
Right. And I'd like $1 million, which is also crazy too. I mean, we've done it, but it's kind of crazy that you go to somebody with anything and they give you $1 million. I mean, you could go to the bank and ask for $1 million and say, hey, I'm going to start a restaurant,
Well, it's interesting. I mean, as you know, I invested in a couple restaurants a long time ago. Wouldn't do it anymore. And they were actually surprisingly successful. And one of them was a very, probably above average success for a new restaurant in San Francisco. Right. So I think I doubled my money, maybe a bit more.
Right.
But I didn't 10x, 20x, 100x my money. And I could have easily lost it. And if the restaurant had failed, Google would not have acqui-hired it.
Right.
Right. So of course, does it make sense for people, for there to be this supply of venture capital and angel capital for tech businesses that wouldn't be in other businesses? Yes, that does make sense, because there is the potential to invest in something that becomes an Uber or Google or Facebook. And that's not going to happen,
right?
For many other types of businesses. And, part of that is the technological change, the pace of change, the speed in which things can grow, fast in the world, the digital world.
Yeah.
But of course, it also comes in waves of sort of the tourists coming in and thinking they're all going to do this. And, back in 99, it seemed like everybody in San Francisco, even if you weren't technical or a business person at all, was working at some .com.
Right.
In marketing or PR or who knows what. I mean, all sorts of people were working on all these crazy .coms. And then when the dot-com crash came, most of those people never went back into tech. They they went back to other industries. Many of them left the Bay Area. And of course, in the last few years, it's been hot to be a founder again.
Right.
And, some entrepreneurs who are younger, if their entire career as an entrepreneur is 2010 to 2015,
right,
they've never, been in an environment where funding isn't sort of unusually a little easier than normal. And not that it's easy, because the reality is it's not, but it's been easier, a bit easier than maybe is normal. And so there are probably going to be entrepreneurs that are, they're going to discover, a harsher climate than they're used to, if that's the only kind of market that they've been used to. And maybe people will leave again, and maybe this sort of fashionable idea that everybody can whip up an app and be a tech entrepreneur will diminish a bit and go back to something a bit more normal.
Well, people forget that Friendster, social networking itself, started in like just the crappiest of time. I mean, it was over. Like it actually wasn't just that it was like a trough. Now we know it was a trough, but at the time it was like, well, the internet was pretty cool. It'll probably still be around, but everything that could possibly be invented has been invented. And then...
And not even worth anything. I mean, even though in 2002, when I started working on the ideas behind Friendster, PayPal and Google and Yahoo and eBay and Amazon, all those companies already existed. Right. And actually we're continuing to grow during that time. After the dot-com boom, the dot-com crash, people just didn't want to hear it. Right. People acted like the internet was like the dumbest thing ever. And the reality is the number of people who were online and had broadband, there were not only were there no smartphones, most people were just getting digital cameras. I mean, it was, the technology was different, but people were very, very negative about the internet, and all the VC firms pretty much stopped investing. They revised their websites to just, replace internet with software to pretend that the internet hadn't even happened. I mean, it became a bad word.
Right.
And that was actually not fun. That was it was kind of depressing.
Yeah.
But but the weird thing was, it gave me a bit of time to come up with what at the time were some pretty weird ideas. I mean, the idea that people were going to go online, use their real name, their real photo.
Right.
Not just entrepreneurs looking to network, but like regular people, that this would become a mainstream phenomenon. Everybody would use their real name on the internet with their real photo, and then you would somehow graph on a website who you were friends with in the real life or not. Those were pretty weird ideas. And now, I think it's hard to understand how much this is taken for granted, but back then it was just completely counterintuitive. And when MySpace and Facebook started, Friendster had already had millions of users and a deluge of press coverage, and everybody understood these ideas. But when I was first working on it, I had no idea if this was going to be anything that 1,000 people would do, much less millions.
Is it ever weird now when you just look at, like, I don't know, maybe you're just over it, like when you go, holy fuck, like this little thing that I did in my room, like everyone in the world is doing it now. Like if you hadn't done, like who knows what would have happened? Like, did you ever just go, whoa, that's weird? Or is it like, so it goes.
It is weird, but on a day-to-day basis, you don't, you move on with your life and your family and your work and all the things that you're doing. And, but, as like every week there's some reminder that comes up, we'll be talking to somebody and they'll be like, I met my spouse on Friendster out of the blue. They'll just blurt that out, or some weird thing like that.
Yeah. I had a funny conversation. I was teaching like via Skype a class at Boston College, and, the professor, at the end kind of goes, hey, so whatever happened to Friendster? Like that's like, a minute answer. And I don't think the students could have cared less, actually. They're like, well, what's that? Or, they're Snapchatting. But, one of the things I told them was like, one of the things that you forget about that company has a management legacy in addition to having changed how people connect in the world. I was like, whatever happened, at some point, Jonathan Abrams the founder wasn't there. I was like, that company was a rocket ship for every second that you were there. Like,
which was only a year.
Right. But, what happened? Like, did Jonathan do something like, No, there's like no second. And even the momentum that he created, it wasn't until like a year later that the kind of different problems and things started occurring. And I think one of the legacies is that certain people in Silicon Valley have kind of realized that not having a founder around can be a problem. And I think that's kind of infused its way into a few companies, not the least of which is Facebook, which is uniquely successful and over which the founder has a unique amount of control.
That's true. And I think that most famous VCs, their biggest successes were actually companies where the founders stayed and were in control. And those are probably their biggest successes. And in the cases where VCs have sort of pushed out founders sort of excessively, I think they actually probably hurt themselves.
Yeah.
I think the reality is, so Noam Wasserman at Harvard, who studies this, a few years ago, he wrote that the stats on founding CEOs being pushed out of venture-backed companies was like 4 to 5. And it shouldn't be 0. There are some founders who don't necessarily have the skill set to take it to the next level.
Right.
And there's some founders who end up doing things that they shouldn't do. Of course, they're human. So it shouldn't be 0, but 4 to 5 was just kind of crazy, and that was the norm for a while. And the few actual, and I think that was not based on science. That was based on sort of a presumption.
Right.
And I think really the presumption should be the opposite presumption, and that's now what firms like Andreessen Horowitz were sort of, that was what their founding philosophy was, that we want to help the entrepreneurs, not get rid of them.
Right.
The few studies that I've seen, and there's only been like a couple that somebody, some VC I know has tweeted or I've seen, the few studies I've seen about the success of companies that retain the founders versus not have shown the companies where the entrepreneurs stayed were more successful.
Right.
And again, I'm not saying that every founder should be the CEO of every founding CEO should be CEO for life of every company. That's obviously not
right.
Not right. But back when it was 4 to 5 founders being very quickly replaced just as a presumption was probably a bad idea.
Right. And generally by somebody who worked at a big famous company and did nothing. Like had some VP of mobile title at Google and did not invent Google and did not invent mobile and did not invent Android, but they, present themselves very well. And
yeah, and when people would say, okay, here's a entrepreneur who has the vision for this company, they may not be the super experienced big company person. What if we brought in a COO to help that person, like obviously Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook? Yep. Sometimes, 10, 15 years ago, the answer would be, if we try to get a COO, we're not going to be able to attract the best person. We really need that world-class CEO.
Right.
As I have, now acquired another 10, 15 years of experience, with companies that I've been an advisor to or angel investor in, companies at Founders Den, all sorts of VCs who I'm friends with and hear about all I've come to realize that was probably pretty wrong logic. Yeah. And the reality is, if you think about it, why would a world-class CEO want to go and work at a Series A startup that just raised $10 million from some famous VC and then they want to get rid of the founder? Why would the world-class CEO want that job?
Right.
And the reality is, an entrepreneurial company probably needs an entrepreneur running it.
Right.
Somebody who is who's been CEO of huge companies, that person's not really an entrepreneur. They have a different skill set. And some entrepreneurs may not be able to actually do that when that comes to that. But that's that's a pretty different thing than a founder getting pushed out after an A or B round. And the idea that somebody, would, instead of taking a job as a VP at Facebook or Google or Uber, or a CXO job or something like that, one of the just companies that's incredibly successful, that they would, instead of having that, which probably they'd have as an option, their choice would be to go and be the CEO of a Series A company backed by some fancy Santa Road VC firm. Even I realize now, why are they making that choice?
Right.
What is it about? Is it about ego?
Yeah.
And, was the company really missing ego? Was that really the thing that the founder was missing that needed to be complemented?
All right, we'll wrap that up there. Part 2 of my conversation with Jonathan next week with Jonathan Abrams. Thanks again for listening. This has been the Something Venture Podcast.